She had a key to my house, a key that didn't work. Amy Roberts, self-proclaimed HOA president, stood on my doorstep demanding entry to inspect her property. My house isn't even in the HOA. When her key snapped in half, she called 911 and reported me for trespassing in my own home. While she performed this theater for the neighbors, I made my own call to someone who could change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Amy Roberts marched up my driveway like she owned the place. Clipboard in one hand, keys jingling in the other, wearing the kind of confidence that only comes from being wrong about everything but saying it loudly enough that people start questioning reality. "Excuse me, this is my property to inspect," were the first words out of her mouth. Not hello, not good morning, just straight to claiming ownership of my sanctuary. Amy introduced herself as the HOA president of Maple Ridge, which would have been impressive if my house was actually in Maple Ridge. She waved those keys like Excalibur, apparently convinced that if she believed hard enough, physics would bend to her will. The key drama that followed was like watching someone try to start a car with a house key. Try number 1. Confident insertion, expectant twist, confused jiggling. Try number 2. Harder pressure, muttering about locks being changed illegally. Try number 3. Actual force that made metal scrape against metal. Try number 4. Pure determination mixed with rising panic. Try number 5. The key snapped in half. Amy's explanation for the broken key was delivered with professional authority. She claimed the previous management company never updated their records, that locks weren't supposed to be changed without HOA approval, and that I was essentially squatting in her jurisdiction. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the way she kept glancing at the house like she was seeing ghosts. When I asked for her documentation, Amy's professional mask slipped for exactly 2 seconds. And what I saw underneath was pure concentrated rage. That's when she dropped the bombshell that explained everything. I used to own this house. The foreclosure had happened 8 months ago. The same 8 months I'd been turning this place into my refuge. The neighbors started gathering like this was dinner theater. Margaret Walsh from across the street, Dave Kumar from next door, Lisa Thompson from 2 houses down. They formed a little semicircle of suburban drama, phones out, recording everything. Amy played to the crowd, explaining how hardworking Americans like herself were being pushed out by entitled tech bros who thought money could buy respect. That's when Ted Williams emerged from his front door like some kind of retired superhero. 67 years old, built like someone who had spent decades arguing with prosecutors and winning. Amy's entire demeanor changed when she saw him. The professional authority evaporated, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. Ted didn't say much during Amy's performance, just stood there taking mental notes. But when she finished, Ted looked at me with an expression that said, "Son, you have no idea what you're dealing with." Amy's parting shot was delivered with venom usually reserved for war criminals. "I'll get my house back one way or another." She dropped a business card on my doormat, got in her car, and drove off with aggressive acceleration that screamed, "This isn't over." The certified letter arrived 48 hours later. $8,000 in fines for 23 violations I'd apparently committed against community standards I'd never agreed to follow. The violations were absolutely insane. Grass height 2.1 inches instead of the required 2 inches. Mailbox positioned 3 degrees off the approved center line. Improper seasonal decorations in October, when I literally had 0 decorations up. Ted knocked on my door the next morning carrying a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes. Amy had tried the exact same property scam on Ted 2 years earlier, complete with fake violations, threatening letters, and bogus claims about HOA authority. The difference was that Ted had spent 40 years as a public defender. The story Ted told me made my blood pressure spike. Amy had targeted Ted's dying wife with harassment about their flower garden. For 6 months, while his wife was fighting cancer, Amy had bombarded them with fake fines and legal threats about removing the roses his wife had planted for their 50th wedding anniversary. But here's where the story got terrifying. Ted had been doing detective work since Amy first showed up at my door. Amy's real estate license had been suspended 4 months ago for ethics violations. She was still showing properties and collecting commissions while practicing without a license, which is a straight-up felony. My work performance started circling the drain. I was missing deadlines, getting client complaints, and fielding concern calls from my brother. I created a spreadsheet to track Amy's contradictions because that's what programmers do when reality stops making sense. Amy's public meltdown at the local coffee shop was pure performance art. According to witnesses who filmed the entire breakdown, Amy launched into a 15-minute lecture about disrespectful millennials and the decline of American community standards. But Amy's most effective weapon wasn't her fake legal documents. It was fear. She convinced neighbors that I was dangerous, that property values would collapse, that children weren't safe. The social isolation hit harder than expected. Suddenly, I couldn't buy coffee without feeling eyes on me. 2 weeks later, Amy came back with backup. She rolled up during prime neighborhood drama hour with a locksmith, official-looking documents, and theatrical confidence that suggested she'd been practicing this performance for days. Amy positioned herself directly in front of my door and announced to her growing audience that she was calling the police on a dangerous criminal illegally occupying her property. 10 neighbors had materialized by this point, phones out and recording, picking sides like they were choosing teams for the most expensive game of capture the flag in human history. But here's where all those years of divorce-induced paranoia became useful. While Amy was delivering her Oscar-worthy monologue about being threatened, I was speed-dialing the non-emergency line, praying that my college friend Mia Gonzalez was working dispatch. 911 dispatch, this is Mia. I explained the entire situation in under 30 seconds, asking if there was any way to add context to the call log before the responding officer arrived. Mia's response was pure professional magic. Email me your evidence right now, and I'll attach it to the file. While Amy continued her theatrical masterpiece, I was frantically uploading photos, purchase documents, property surveys, and a complete timeline of Amy's harassment campaign to the police department's non-emergency email system. Officer Jackson climbed out of his patrol car with relaxed professionalism that suggested he'd responded to about 1,000 similar calls. He approached both Amy and me with equal skepticism, which immediately threw Amy off her script. The look on Amy's face when Officer Jackson asked her for her court order file number was priceless. It was like watching someone realize their Wi-Fi password had stopped working. Amy started stammering about having documentation and authority, but when pressed for specifics, her professional confidence evaporated. Officer Jackson's response was delivered with patient authority. Ma'am, civil documents don't authorize forced property entry. Without a writ of possession signed by a judge, this locksmith can't legally change these locks. The crowd of neighbors who had been filming Amy's anticipated victory suddenly got very quiet, because they were now recording her first major public defeat. After that 911 call, I realized something crucial. The difference between me getting arrested and Amy getting embarrassed came down to 6 minutes of evidence uploading and a college friend who knew how to work within the system. As Amy stormed off, she left something behind on my doorstep. A business card, but not the professional real estate card she'd been handing out. This one was older, with a different company name and a license number that didn't match anything she'd shown me before. Ted examined it like he was studying evidence in a murder trial, then disappeared into his house for phone calls I could hear through our shared wall. When he finally came over to explain what he had discovered, his hands were shaking. Amy hadn't just lost her real estate license. She'd been operating under multiple business identities for years. The card belonged to a property management company that had been shut down by the state for fraud 3 years ago. Ted's contacts in the legal community had been tracking Amy's activities across different counties. The reason they hadn't arrested her yet was simple. They were building a federal case. The public records request cost me $150 and took 5 business days to process. The documents that arrived were partially redacted, but what remained visible was enough to make my hands shake. Amy had called 911 7 times in the past 2 years, always about the exact same issue: residents refusing to comply with her authority. The calls came from 4 different addresses across 3 different counties. If Amy had called 911 about her own house being robbed, that meant she was claiming primary residence at a different address than the one she'd used in her court filings against me. You can't claim homestead exemptions at multiple addresses simultaneously. That's fraud, perjury, and false filing. The emergency court motion Ted filed from his hospital bed was a thing of beauty. 40 years of legal experience distilled into 15 pages of pure prosecutorial fury. Amy's claim of living in my house during the 8 months before I bought it was physically impossible because she'd been claiming primary residence at 2 other addresses during the same period. The courtroom was packed for our emergency hearing. When the court clerk verified her surveyor's license status in real time, suspended 8 months ago for fraudulent boundary assessments, Amy's face went through 5 stages of grief in 30 seconds. Watching Amy try to explain why she'd called 911 about her own house while claiming ownership of mine was like watching someone explain how they're simultaneously in 2 places at once. Amy's meltdown was spectacular. The professional mask finally came off entirely, revealing the entitled Karen underneath. She screamed about knowing the neighborhood better than anyone, about protecting property values from destructive outsiders, about justice for hardworking Americans being stolen by entitled millennials. When those handcuffs clicked shut, I felt something I hadn't felt since before my marriage fell apart. The sweet, beautiful sound of justice actually working. The FBI agents, who had been building their case for months, finally had enough evidence to arrest Amy for mail fraud, wire fraud, and elder abuse. Her criminal enterprise had stolen over $340,000 from 15 families across 3 states. The community healing process was awkward but necessary. Margaret Walsh brought homemade cookies and an apology. Dave Kumar became my workout partner. Lisa Thompson organized a neighborhood watch program that actually brought people together. Amy's fate was exactly what she deserved. 18 months in federal prison, for $100,000 in restitution payments, and a criminal record that would follow her forever. Looking back, the whole experience taught me something important about standing up for yourself. My house became home not when I painted the walls or planted flowers, but when I stopped being afraid to fight for it. The broken key became my reminder that sometimes the people who seem most powerful are actually the most desperate. Amy's criminal enterprise had operated successfully for 15 years, because she targeted isolated people who were too overwhelmed to fight back. The moment she picked someone with resources, connections, and the stubborn refusal to be controlled by fake authority, her entire operation began to unravel. Next time someone shows up at your door claiming authority over your property, ask for badge numbers, court file numbers, and supervising judge names before you believe a single word they say. Real authority comes with real documentation. Fake authority comes with broken keys, fabricated violations, and desperate confidence that crumbles under basic scrutiny. Sometimes the system actually works, justice actually happens, and Karen actually gets arrested. This was one of those times.